A woman like you could never afford this seat!
You may want to read the ticket first.
Security is removing you now! Stop. The captain needs to see this.
Somebody get this black grandma out of my first class before she ruins the entire cabin. Senior flight attendant Vanessa Cole sneered as she ripped the boarding pass from Dorothy Ellison's trembling hand. Without even glancing at it, she crumpled the ticket and tossed it onto the polished aisle floor, before kicking the elderly woman's worn leather carry-on several feet away. She folded her arms with a mocking smile. You really thought a black grandma dressed like that could afford this seat? She said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. First class isn't a charity lounge. Vanessa took one slow step closer, looked Dorothy up and down with open contempt, then laughed. Look around you, she said, gesturing toward the well-dressed passengers. These people paid to travel in comfort, not to watch someone who clearly doesn't belong wander in here pretending she fits. A few nervous chuckles echoed through the cabin. Vanessa wasn't finished. Do yourself a favor, she said coldly. Walk off this airplane with what's left of your dignity before security has to remove you in front of everyone. The cabin fell silent. 74-year-old Dorothy Ellison slowly bent to retrieve her boarding pass, leaning on her walnut cane with quiet dignity. Before she could reach it, Vanessa stepped in front of her and shoved her backward. When I said move, Vanessa snapped. Security can escort you off before the real passengers start boarding. Several travelers lowered their eyes in discomfort. Others quietly raised their phones, sensing they were witnessing something they would never forget. Dorothy never argued. She calmly picked up her boarding pass, looked directly at Vanessa, and said in a steady voice, "Kindness costs nothing. Someday you'll understand how expensive arrogance can be." 10 minutes later, every person on that aircraft would discover why judging someone by appearance can become the most costly mistake of a lifetime. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. If stories about courage, dignity, and unforgettable justice speak to you, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because the truth is only beginning to unfold. Hey everyone, somewhere ahead, the road bends and I have no idea what's waiting past it. That's exactly why I'm going. Come find out with me. Long before Flight SB-701 became the center of attention, Dorothy Ellison had begun her morning, the same way she had for decades, with quiet gratitude. The 74-year-old black grandmother woke before sunrise in her modest brownstone outside Newark. Instead of calling a chauffeur, she brewed her own coffee, watered the flowers on her small front porch, and spent 15 minutes writing in a worn leather journal that had traveled with her for nearly 40 years. She believed every important decision should begin with a clear heart. Today's entry contained only one sentence. May people remember how they made others feel. She closed the notebook with a gentle smile. No one watching her leave home would have guessed that within a few hours, she would quietly take control of one of America's fastest-growing private aviation companies. Her gray cardigan had been mended twice. Her walking shoes showed years of use. The walnut cane she carried had once belonged to her late husband, Air Force mechanic Benjamin Ellison, who had taught her that dignity never needed expensive clothes. At 7:30 that morning, Dorothy arrived at Teterboro Airport in an ordinary taxi. The driver offered to carry her luggage. She thanked him warmly, insisted on paying the full fare, then quietly slipped an extra $100 bill into his hand. "For your daughter's college fund," she said, after noticing the family photo taped beside the dashboard. The driver blinked in surprise. You remembered? You told me about her dream last year," Dorothy replied with a gentle smile. "Dreams deserve people who remember them." The man watched her disappear into the terminal, shaking his head. Some people carried wealth in their bank accounts. Dorothy carried hers in the way she treated strangers. Inside the executive terminal, Polished marble reflected the morning sunlight pouring through enormous glass walls. Private jets lined the runway outside like silver arrows waiting for takeoff. Business executives hurried past with expensive watches and designer luggage. Dorothy walked slowly, careful with every step. Near the entrance, a young cleaning employee accidentally knocked over a bucket while changing a trash liner. Water spread across the polished floor. Several passengers frowned and stepped around the mess without saying a word. One businessman muttered, "Unbelievable." The young employee's face turned crimson. "I'm so sorry." Before he could kneel, Dorothy carefully rested her cane against the wall and bent down herself. "Oh, please don't," the young man pleaded. "You'll hurt your back." She smiled. "If we both help, we'll finish twice as fast." Together they gathered paper towels and wiped the floor before anyone slipped. When they finished, the embarrassed employee whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." Dorothy simply replied, "Someday someone will help me too." Neither of them noticed a woman watching from across the lounge. Vanessa Cole, senior flight attendant. Perfect navy uniform, perfect makeup, perfect posture. She prided herself on maintaining what she called the first-class image. To Vanessa, appearances mattered almost as much as safety. She glanced toward Dorothy and immediately frowned. Older woman, simple clothes, taxi arrival. Helping janitorial staff. Everything about Dorothy fit the picture Vanessa had already created in her mind. She never considered that the picture might be wrong. Instead, she quietly walked over to another flight attendant. "Keep an eye on the lady with the gray sweater," Vanessa whispered. "The one helping the cleaner." "Yes." "What about her?" Vanessa lowered her voice. "I've seen people wander into private terminals before pretending they're on the passenger list." The younger attendant looked uncertain. But she hasn't done anything." "Not yet." The younger attendant glanced back toward Dorothy. Something about the elderly woman seemed different. There was no nervousness, no confusion, no desperation, only remarkable calm. Still, she nodded. Vanessa had seniority. Questioning her rarely ended well. Meanwhile, Dorothy approached the reception desk. "Good morning," she said. The receptionist smiled warmly. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Dorothy handed over a thick, ivory-colored boarding envelope embossed with the silver Skybridge Executive Aviation logo. The receptionist scanned it. For a brief second, her computer displayed an unusual notification before quickly disappearing. "VIP access verified." Then another encrypted message flashed across the screen. "Executive authorization confirmed. Contact operations upon boarding." Before the receptionist could read further, the system automatically cleared the alert. She blinked. Perhaps it was simply another executive traveler. She handed the boarding pass back with a smile. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Ellison." Dorothy thanked her and slowly continued toward Gate 3. From across the terminal, Vanessa noticed the receptionist's polite smile. Her expression tightened. "Interesting," she murmured. She walked to the desk moments later. Was there an issue with that passenger? The receptionist hesitated. "No. Everything looked fine." Vanessa folded her arms. "Are you sure?" "I believe so." Vanessa wasn't convinced. She had trusted first impressions throughout her career. They had never failed her. At least that's what she believed. Outside, the sleek Gulfstream G700 gleamed beneath the morning sun. Ground crews completed the final inspections. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Reeves reviewed weather reports, while First Officer Elena Brooks completed departure checklists. Neither of them knew headquarters had quietly instructed operations to expect a confidential executive guest. No announcement, no publicity, absolute discretion. Back in the terminal, boarding began. Passengers entered in small groups: executives, investors, corporate attorneys, a retired Marine, a famous orthopedic surgeon, all greeted with warm smiles. Then Dorothy reached the boarding scanner. The boarding agent scanned her pass. A soft green light appeared. "Welcome aboard." Before the agent could greet her, Vanessa stepped forward. Her eyes lingered on Dorothy's cardigan, on the worn leather bag, on the old cane. Something inside her refused to believe what the scanner had just confirmed. Instead of welcoming the elderly woman aboard, Vanessa forced a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning," she said coolly. "I'll personally help you find your seat." Dorothy smiled back, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that the worst part of her journey was only beginning. Behind them, the younger flight attendant watched with growing concern. For reasons she couldn't explain, she suddenly had a feeling that this ordinary-looking grandmother was about to change every life on that airplane. Dorothy Ellison followed Vanessa Cole through the narrow aisle with slow, careful steps, her walnut cane tapping softly against the polished cabin floor. The elegant interior of the Gulfstream G700 glowed beneath warm, recessed lighting, every cream leather seat perfectly prepared for departure. The other passengers barely looked up. Most were occupied with laptops, financial reports, or quiet conversations. Dorothy stopped beside Seat 2A and smiled politely. "I believe this is mine." She reached into her handbag and unfolded her boarding pass. Vanessa didn't even glance at it. Instead, she looked Dorothy up and down once more, before letting out a short, mocking laugh. There must be some mistake. Dorothy remained calm. "I don't believe so." "Oh, I do." Vanessa extended her hand. "Give me the boarding pass." Dorothy handed it over without hesitation. Vanessa looked at the elegant boarding envelope for less than a second before shaking her head. "I've worked first class for nearly 10 years, she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I know exactly who belongs here." She folded the boarding pass without checking the printed seat number. "I think you've wandered onto the wrong aircraft." Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman wearing a tailored Italian suit glanced toward Dorothy before smirking. "I was wondering how long that would take," he muttered to the man beside him. The second businessman chuckled quietly. Dorothy's expression never changed. "My name is Dorothy Ellison," she said gently. "The boarding agent verified my seat before I came aboard." Vanessa crossed her arms. Then the boarding agent made a mistake. She stepped between Dorothy and seat 2A, blocking the elderly woman completely. "I'm going to ask you one last time." Her smile disappeared. "Please leave first class voluntarily." Several passengers now stopped pretending not to watch. The silence inside the cabin became uncomfortable. Dorothy spoke with the same calm voice. "I paid for nothing today." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me. I simply accepted the seat assigned to me." Vanessa interpreted the sentence exactly the wrong way. "So someone gave you this ticket?" Dorothy nodded slightly. "Yes." Vanessa laughed again. "I knew it." She turned toward the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why we verify premium seating." Embarrassed murmurs spread through the aircraft. One woman looked away. Another passenger quietly unlocked his phone camera. Vanessa held up Dorothy's boarding pass without opening it. "This happens more often than you'd think." Dorothy spoke softly. "If you open the envelope, everything will become clear." Instead of opening it, Vanessa tucked the boarding pass beneath her tablet. I don't need paperwork to recognize when something doesn't make sense. The younger flight attendant, Emily Parker, hesitated before stepping closer. Vanessa. What? Maybe we should scan the pass again. Vanessa shot her a sharp look. Are you questioning my judgment? Emily immediately fell silent. No. I didn't think so. Dorothy turned toward Emily and offered a reassuring smile, almost as though she were comforting the younger woman instead. That unexpected kindness only made Emily feel worse. Vanessa suddenly bent down, grabbed Dorothy's worn leather carry-on, and dragged it into the aisle. The bag tipped over. A leather-bound journal slipped halfway out. Vanessa nudged the suitcase forward with her foot. If you're leaving anyway, she said coldly, you may as well take your things. Gasps echoed through the cabin. Dorothy slowly reached toward her luggage. Before her fingers touched the handle, Vanessa stepped forward and placed one hand firmly against Dorothy's shoulder. I said move. The shove wasn't violent enough to knock Dorothy down, but it was enough to force the 74-year-old woman backward. Her cane slipped. For one terrifying second, she lost her balance. A retired Marine named Robert Hayes immediately stood and caught her arm before she could fall. I've got you, ma'am. Dorothy looked at him gratefully. Thank you. Robert turned toward Vanessa, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. I've served this country for 31 years. He looked directly into her eyes. And I just watched you shove an elderly woman who hasn't raised her voice once. Vanessa didn't flinch. Sir, please remain seated. No. I said remain seated. Robert folded his arms. I'll sit when you stop treating her like she doesn't deserve basic respect. Several passengers quietly nodded. The businessman who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably. Even he was beginning to realize the situation had gone too far. Vanessa refused to back down. She pointed toward Dorothy. She's delaying departure. Robert answered immediately. No. He gestured around the cabin. You are? A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the rows. Emily stepped forward again. Vanessa, maybe we should ask the captain. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She hated being challenged in front of passengers. Without another word, she pressed the interphone. Captain Reeves to the cabin immediately. Seconds later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Michael Reeves stepped into the aisle. What seems to be the problem? Vanessa answered before anyone else could speak. This passenger somehow boarded with what appears to be an invalid first-class assignment? Dorothy calmly lifted one hand. My boarding pass is still beneath her tablet. The captain looked toward Vanessa. Have you verified it? Vanessa hesitated for only a fraction of a second. I've seen enough. Before Captain Reeves could respond, his company-issued phone vibrated inside his jacket. The screen displayed only 2 words. Executive Operations. He answered immediately. This is Captain Reeves. Everyone watched his face. His expression gradually shifted from routine professionalism to complete confusion. What? He glanced toward Dorothy, then toward Vanessa. I'm looking at all passengers now. A pause. Another long silence. Finally, the executive on the other end spoke words that made the captain's heartbeat quicken. Do not close the aircraft door. Captain Reeves straightened. Understood. And listen carefully. The executive lowered his voice. The individual you're looking for has already boarded. Headquarters is on its way. Absolutely no passenger leaves this aircraft until our legal team arrives. The line disconnected. The captain slowly lowered the phone. Every eye in the cabin remained fixed on him. Vanessa forced an awkward smile. So, should I continue removing her? Captain Reeves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Dorothy. For the first time, he noticed something unusual. Despite everything that had just happened, she showed no anger, no panic, no humiliation. Only extraordinary patience. It was the expression of someone who already knew how this story would end, and somehow that unsettled him far more than the shouting ever could. The silence inside the Gulfstream G700 stretched so long that even the hum of the auxiliary engines seemed unusually loud. Captain Michael Reeves slowly slipped his company phone back into his jacket. No one moved. No one spoke. Vanessa Cole finally broke the silence. "Captain," she said confidently, "I assume headquarters is handling another issue. May I continue escorting this passenger off the aircraft?" Michael didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Dorothy Ellison. There was something strangely familiar about her calm expression. Not her face exactly, but the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. She had just been humiliated in front of an entire cabin, yet she stood with remarkable composure, as though she had already accepted whatever came next. He turned back to Vanessa. "Give me her boarding pass." Vanessa hesitated. "I've already reviewed it. I didn't ask whether you reviewed it." His tone grew firmer. "I asked for the boarding pass." Reluctantly, Vanessa pulled the elegant ivory envelope from beneath her tablet and handed it over. Michael opened it. His eyes moved across the printed information. Seat 2A, passenger name Dorothy Ellison. Boarding authorization valid. Security clearance verified. Everything appeared perfectly normal. He frowned. "There isn't anything wrong with this ticket." Vanessa blinked. "That can't be right." Michael handed the pass back to Dorothy. "It scans as completely valid." For the first time since boarding began, uncertainty flickered across Vanessa's face. "But, Captain..." Before she could continue, Robert Hayes, the retired Marine, stepped forward. "I told you." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "This lady has done absolutely nothing wrong." Vanessa folded her arms. "Sir, with respect, you weren't responsible for maintaining first-class standards." Robert looked directly at her. "No. I was responsible for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." His words landed heavily throughout the cabin. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Emily Parker, the younger flight attendant, finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Captain..." Michael looked at her. "Go ahead." "I was standing nearby from the beginning." She swallowed nervously. Mrs. Ellison never raised her voice. Vanessa turned sharply. "Emily." "She showed her boarding pass the moment you asked." "Emily." "And Mrs. Ellison actually asked us to verify it again." Vanessa's expression hardened. "That's enough." Emily lowered her gaze but continued anyway. "I think we made a mistake." The cabin grew even quieter. Vanessa stared at her junior colleague in disbelief. "So now you're accusing me of discriminating against passengers?" Emily quickly shook her head. "I'm saying we should have verified the facts before assuming the worst." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "I've spent 10 years building my reputation." She looked around the cabin. "Does anyone honestly believe I would remove a passenger without good reason?" For several uncomfortable seconds, no one answered. Not because they supported her, because they had all witnessed what happened. The businessman who had laughed earlier slowly cleared his throat. Everyone turned toward him. "I owe Mrs. Ellison an apology." Vanessa stared at him. "What I shouldn't have assumed she was in the wrong. He looked at Dorothy. I'm sorry. Dorothy offered a small, gracious smile. Thank you. She accepted the apology without bitterness. That simple act somehow made the businessman feel even more ashamed. Meanwhile, Michael's phone vibrated again. Another secure message. Operations ETA 6 minutes. Delay departure. Before he could respond, the cockpit interphone buzzed. Captain First Officer Elena Brooks said from inside the flight deck, "Ground control wants to know why we're still parked." Michael pressed the interphone. "Tell them we're awaiting executive authorization." Executive authorization. Yes. There was a brief pause. Understood. When the interphone disconnected, Vanessa looked increasingly confused. What executive authorization? Michael answered honestly. I don't know. That answer made the atmosphere even stranger. A routine departure had suddenly become an executive matter. Outside the aircraft windows, several black SUVs entered the restricted ramp area. Their tinted windows reflected the morning sunlight. Airport employees instinctively stepped aside. Emily noticed them first. Captain, she pointed toward the terminal. I don't think that's normal. So Michael followed her gaze. Neither did he. 3 luxury SUVs stopped beside the aircraft stairs. Several men and women wearing executive credentials stepped out. Behind them walked 2 attorneys carrying slim black document cases. Vanessa forced a nervous smile. They're probably here because this passenger filed a complaint. Dorothy quietly adjusted her cardigan. She still hadn't said more than a handful of sentences. Robert watched her with growing curiosity. Most people would be furious. Some would demand compensation. Others would threaten lawsuits. Dorothy did none of those things. She simply waited, almost peacefully. Robert leaned toward her. Ma'am. She looked at him kindly. Yes, I don't know who you are. She smiled. Neither do most people. But somehow. Robert hesitated. I don't think you're worried about any of this. Dorothy's eyes drifted toward the aircraft door. Worry changes very little. What changes things? She answered without taking her eyes off the entrance. Character. At that exact moment, the aircraft door opened. Everyone instinctively turned. A sharply dressed woman in her early 50s climbed aboard first. Behind her came 2 corporate attorneys. Then another executive carrying a thick leather portfolio embossed with the silver Skybridge Executive Aviation logo. None of them looked at Vanessa. None of them acknowledged the other passengers. Instead, their eyes immediately began searching the cabin. The lead executive spoke with controlled urgency. Please remain seated, everyone. Her voice was calm, but unmistakably authoritative. We're looking for 1 passenger. Vanessa stepped forward confidently. I'm the senior flight attendant. Can I help you? The executive barely glanced at her. Not at the moment. She continued scanning the rows, then her eyes suddenly stopped. Her entire expression softened. There you are. She exhaled with obvious relief. We've been trying to reach you. Every passenger followed her line of sight. Every head turned toward the same person. Dorothy Ellison. Vanessa frowned in confusion. Before she could ask another question, the lead attorney quietly opened his leather case and removed a thick folder stamped Confidential, Executive Ownership Transfer. Vanessa felt the color drain from her face. For the very first time that morning, she realized this elderly black grandmother might not be the ordinary passenger she had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating. The cabin remained frozen. No one spoke as the executive team stepped fully aboard the Gulfstream. The woman leading the group, dressed in a charcoal business suit with a silver Sky Bridge executive aviation badge pinned neatly to her lapel, scanned the cabin one final time before smiling warmly. "There you are, Mrs. Ellison." Dorothy returned the smile. "I'm sorry for the delay." The executive shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am. The delay is entirely our responsibility." Those words echoed through the silent cabin. Vanessa frowned. She stepped forward, forcing a polite smile that barely concealed her growing anxiety. "I'm Vanessa Cole, Senior First-Class Flight Attendant." The executive nodded briefly. "I know. If this concerns a customer complaint, I'd be happy to explain what happened." "We'll hear everyone's explanation." The response was calm. But not yet. Without another word, the executive walked directly toward Dorothy. "May I?" She gestured toward the elderly woman's carry-on still lying awkwardly in the aisle. Dorothy nodded. The executive bent down herself, carefully, lifted the worn leather bag with both hands, brushed away a faint layer of dust from where it had struck the floor, and gently placed it beside Siete 2A. "I'm deeply sorry that your belongings were treated this way." Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. A corporate executive, apologizing personally to an elderly passenger. Something about this situation no longer made sense. Vanessa quickly laughed, hoping to regain control. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The executive slowly turned. "What misunderstanding?" "This passenger entered first class under unusual circumstances." Dorothy quietly interrupted. "I entered with a valid boarding pass." The executive looked toward Vanessa. How was her boarding authorization invalid? Vanessa hesitated. No. Was her identity in question? Not exactly. Did she threaten anyone? No. Refuse instructions? No. The executive's expression hardened slightly. Then explained precisely why Mrs. Ellison was removed from her assigned seat. Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in years, confidence abandoned her. Across the aisle, Robert Hayes folded his arms. "I can explain." Every eye turned toward the retired Marine. He spoke clearly. "I watched everything." He pointed toward Dorothy. "She boarded peacefully." He pointed toward Vanessa. "Mrs. Ellison offered her boarding pass 3 separate times." He paused. Miss Cole never actually examined it. Quiet murmurs spread through the cabin. The businessman who had laughed earlier slowly raised his hand. "See, I witnessed the same thing." Another passenger spoke. "So did I." Then another. "And me." Within seconds, nearly half the cabin had become witnesses. Emily Parker felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Captain Michael Reeves watched the entire exchange without interrupting. Every new statement painted a clearer picture than the one Vanessa had originally presented. His phone vibrated once again. Another secure message from Executive Operations. "Legal documents confirmed. Remain on aircraft. Do not announce ownership until counsel arrives." Michael read it twice. Ownership. He looked toward the leather portfolio one of the attorneys still held tightly beneath his arm. His curiosity deepened. Meanwhile, the lead attorney quietly stepped closer to Dorothy. "Mrs. Ellison?" She smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." Several executives exchanged quick glances. Daniel smiled respectfully. "I apologize for greeting you under these circumstances. I've had worse mornings." The remark drew a few nervous smiles from nearby passengers. Even now, Dorothy refused to humiliate anyone. She could have demanded immediate answers. Instead, she remained gracious. Vanessa noticed something she hadn't before. Every executive addressed Dorothy with unmistakable respect, not polite customer service, genuine professional respect. The realization sent a chill through her. She quickly tried another approach. "If I may." The lead executive looked toward her. "Our responsibility is to protect premium passengers," Daniel the attorney answered before anyone else could. "And did Mrs. Ellison fail to qualify as one?" Vanessa swallowed. "I believed," Daniel interrupted gently. "We're discussing facts, not assumptions. Facts." The distinction struck like a hammer. Emily lowered her eyes. Robert quietly nodded. Captain Reeves remained completely silent. Outside the aircraft windows, another black SUV rolled to a stop. Two additional executives hurried toward the stairs carrying locked aluminum cases. Ground personnel immediately cleared a path. Inside the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. "Who is she? I've never seen corporate respond this fast. Is she a government official? No. I think she's someone much bigger." The businessman who had mocked Dorothy leaned toward Robert. "I made a terrible mistake," Robert answered quietly. "We all judge too quickly sometimes." He looked toward Vanessa. "The difference is whether we're willing to stop." Vanessa heard every word. For the first time that morning, doubt crept into her mind. She replayed everything. The taxi, the simple cardigan, the worn shoes, helping the janitor, the old leather bag. She had built an entire story about Dorothy, without asking a single meaningful question. Before she could gather her thoughts, another unexpected moment unfolded. Captain Reeves suddenly walked toward Dorothy. "Mrs. Ellison." She looked up. "Yes, Captain." He hesitated. "This may sound unusual." A faint smile crossed Dorothy's face. "Go ahead." "My daughter graduated from the Skybridge Future Pilot Scholarship 3 years ago." Dorothy's expression softened immediately. "Rebecca." Michael blinked. "You remember her name?" "Of course." Dorothy smiled warmly. "She wrote me a thank you letter after earning her wings." The captain stood speechless. That scholarship had transformed his daughter's life. It had paid for flight training his family could never have afforded. He had always wanted to thank the anonymous donor behind the program. No one had ever revealed the benefactor's identity. Until now. Emotion filled his voice. "My daughter flies rescue missions in Alaska." Dorothy's eyes glistened. Then the investment was worth every penny. Michael instinctively straightened. Not because regulations required it, because respect did. The atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted. Passengers who had once viewed Dorothy as an ordinary elderly woman now saw something impossible to ignore. Every executive respected her. The company's lead attorney knew her personally. The captain recognized her from a scholarship that had changed his family's future, yet no one had explained why. Daniel glanced toward the aircraft entrance as another pair of attorneys stepped aboard, carrying a thick navy blue document case sealed with silver locks. He quietly checked his watch. "They're here." The lead executive nodded once. "Good." She turned toward Captain Reeves. "We're ready." Vanessa looked from one face to another, her pulse racing. "Ready for what?" No one answered her. Daniel slowly placed the sealed document case on the polished conference table at the front of the cabin. He entered a security code. The electronic locks clicked open. Inside lay a stack of embossed legal documents bearing multiple signatures, corporate seals, and one title printed boldly across the top page. Final Ownership Transfer Agreement. Vanessa stared at the document. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She still didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but every instinct told her that the next few minutes would change her life forever. The electronic locks clicked open with a crisp, metallic sound. Every conversation inside the cabin stopped. Attorney Daniel Harper carefully removed the thick folder labeled Final Ownership Transfer Agreement and placed it on the polished conference table near the front of the aircraft. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked toward Dorothy with quiet respect. "Mrs. Ellison," he said softly, "before we proceed, is there anything you'd like to address first?" Dorothy glanced around the cabin. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her, some curious, some embarrassed, some frightened. She simply shook her head. "Not yet." Daniel nodded. "As you wish." Vanessa felt her heartbeat quicken. She forced herself to speak. "I'm sorry, but no one has explained what's happening." The lead executive, Amelia Grant, finally turned toward her. "You're correct." Her voice remained calm. "And in a few moments, everything will be explained." Vanessa swallowed. "Does this involve Mrs. Ellison?" "It does." Emily Parker quietly stepped beside Captain Reeves. "Captain?" He looked at her. "I don't think I've ever seen executive operations respond this fast." Michael nodded. "Neither have I." In 23 years of flying, he had experienced mechanical emergencies, medical diversions, even severe weather crises. He had never seen corporate attorneys personally board an aircraft before departure, especially not for a single passenger. Daniel reached into the folder and removed several sealed envelopes. Each bore the signatures of Sky Bridge's board of directors. He handed one to Amelia, another to Captain Reeves. A third remained in his own hands. Vanessa noticed something unusual. Every envelope remained sealed. Whatever information they contained had not yet been shared with anyone, even the captain. Outside the windows, airport personnel had quietly closed access to the boarding area. Ground vehicles formed a discreet perimeter around the aircraft. Passengers noticed it immediately. "Why are they blocking the ramp? Is this some kind of security operation?" "No." Robert Hayes narrowed his eyes. "They're protecting someone." Dorothy heard him. She smiled gently but said nothing. Meanwhile, Daniel approached Captain Reeves. "The captain headquarters asks that you verify one detail before we continue." "Of course." "Have all passengers remained on board since executive operations contacted you?" "Yes." "No one has entered or exited?" "Excellent." Daniel nodded with visible relief. "We needed every witness present." Those words echoed through the cabin. Every witness. Vanessa suddenly felt her stomach tighten. Witnesses. Not passengers. Witnesses. She looked toward Dorothy again. The elderly woman still hadn't demanded an apology. She hadn't threatened legal action. She hadn't even raised her voice. That quiet confidence had become far more unsettling than anger ever could have been. Amelia stepped closer to Dorothy. "Mrs. Ellison?" "Yes. I know today was supposed to remain completely confidential." Dorothy gave a small smile. "Not life doesn't always respect our schedules." A few passengers laughed softly. The tension eased for only a moment. Daniel opened another document. This morning's transfer was finalized at precisely 8:42 a.m. Several executives nodded. Captain Reeves frowned. Transfer of what before anyone could ask another unexpected voice filled the cabin. "Captain Reeves." Everyone turned. First Officer Elena Brooks had stepped out of the cockpit. "I just received another secure transmission." She handed him the tablet. Michael read silently. His eyes widened. Then he looked at Dorothy. His expression changed completely. Not surprise anymore. Recognition. Respect. He slowly walked toward her. Mrs. Ellison. She looked up warmly. Yes, Captain. I owe you something. Dorothy tilted her head slightly. You owe me nothing. I do. His voice grew emotional. My daughter Rebecca. She wasn't the only one your foundation helped. Dorothy remained silent. My younger brother lost his job during the pandemic. He told me. Michael blinked. You remember that too? You wrote about him in your Christmas letter. Michael smiled despite himself. I can't believe you actually read those. I read every one. The cabin fell completely silent. The anonymous scholarship fund that had changed countless aviation careers. The letters. The donations. Some passengers slowly began connecting the pieces. The businessman who had mocked Dorothy whispered to the passenger beside him. Who exactly is she? The man quietly answered. I don't think we're asking the right question anymore. What do you mean? I think we should be asking how important she really is. Vanessa overheard every word. Her palms began to sweat. She replayed the morning again and again. The boarding pass, the executive terminal, the unusual computer alert, the respectful greeting from the receptionist, the attorneys, the executives, the captain. None of it had made sense before. Now, every piece was beginning to fit together. Emily carefully approached Dorothy. Mrs. Ellison. Dorothy smiled. Yes, dear. Emily lowered her eyes. I should have spoken sooner. Dorothy gently touched the young attendant's hand. But you did speak. Not soon enough. Courage rarely arrives as early as we wish. Emily felt tears forming. I'm so sorry. You chose truth when it became difficult. Dorothy squeezed her hand gently. Never stop doing that. Vanessa watched the exchange in silence. For the first time in years, she realized respect could never be demanded by a title. It had to be earned. Daniel closed the folder once more. The board has arrived. Everyone instinctively looked toward the aircraft door. 3 additional directors entered the cabin. Each greeted Dorothy before greeting anyone else. One elderly board member even extended both hands. It's an honor to finally welcome you. Dorothy stood carefully with Robert's assistance. The honor belongs to all of us. The chairman smiled. I believe it's time. Daniel nodded. He turned toward the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. He placed one hand on the thick transfer agreement. But in accordance with federal aviation regulations and the unanimous vote of the Skybridge Executive Aviation Board of Directors. He paused. Every heartbeat inside the aircraft seemed to stop. Vanessa unconsciously took one step backward. We are now prepared to formally introduce the individual whose ownership of this aircraft and controlling interest in Skybridge Executive Aviation became legally effective less than 2 hours ago. Every eye slowly turned toward Dorothy Ellison, and for the first time that morning, Vanessa understood with absolute certainty. The reveal she had feared was no longer coming. It had already arrived. The cabin was so quiet that the faint ticking of a passenger's wristwatch seemed unnaturally loud. Every eye remained fixed on Dorothy Ellison. Attorney Daniel Harper had stopped only inches before the final announcement, allowing the silence to settle over everyone on board. Vanessa Cole suddenly stepped forward. Wait. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. There has to be some misunderstanding. Daniel looked at her without speaking. Vanessa forced herself to continue. Even if Mrs. Ellison is an important investor, that still doesn't explain what happened here. Dorothy remained silent. Daniel calmly replied, What exactly do you believe happened here, Miss Cole? Vanessa drew a slow breath. I enforced company standards. Robert Hayes let out a quiet sigh. No. His voice carried across the cabin. You enforced your assumptions. Vanessa ignored him. I had every reason to question her. Captain Reeves finally spoke. What reason? Vanessa pointed toward Dorothy. She arrived alone. So, she came in an ordinary taxi. Captain Reeves frowned. And she was dressed? Vanessa stopped herself. Dressed how? Daniel asked. Vanessa hesitated. Not like our typical first-class passengers. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. So your decision wasn't based on her boarding pass? No. Not on her identification? No. Not on disruptive behavior? No. Then your decision was based on appearance. Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel didn't need an answer. The silence answered for her. Across the cabin, Emily Parker slowly lowered her eyes. She remembered every moment. The boarding pass Vanessa refused to read. The suitcase kicked across the aisle. The shove, the mocking laughter. Every second had been witnessed. Daniel looked toward Captain Reeves. Captain, does this aircraft continuously record cabin activity while passengers are boarding? It does. Audio as well? Yes. Vanessa's heart skipped. Daniel continued. Excellent. He turned toward Amelia Grant. Please request the boarding footage. Amelia removed her phone immediately. It has already been secured by operations. Vanessa stared. You already have the video. We began preserving evidence the moment Captain Reeves reported an executive incident. Her knees suddenly felt weak. Evidence. Not accusations. Evidence. As she struggled to gather herself, another voice broke the silence. I recorded part of it too. The businessman who had laughed earlier slowly stood. His face burned with embarrassment. I started recording because I thought it would be entertaining. He looked directly at Dorothy. I was wrong. He swallowed hard. I've never regretted pressing a record button more. He handed his phone to Daniel. I want you to have it. Daniel accepted it without comment. Then another passenger stood. I recorded from row 4. A woman near the rear of the cabin lifted her own phone. So did I. Within seconds, 6 different passengers volunteered their videos. Every angle, every word, every shove. Vanessa looked around in disbelief. The entire cabin had become witnesses. There was nowhere left to hide. Emily quietly walked toward Dorothy. I've prepared a written statement. Dorothy smiled gently. You didn't have to. I know. Emily's voice shook. But I needed to. She handed the statement to Daniel. I wrote everything exactly as it happened. Daniel nodded appreciatively. Thank you. Captain Reeves then reached into his jacket. So did I. Everyone turned toward him. I documented the timeline immediately after executive operations called. He placed his incident log beside Emily's statement. The timestamps matched the cabin recordings. Vanessa whispered almost to herself, This can't be happening. Robert heard her. No, he answered quietly. This is accountability. Outside the airport personnel finished placing portable privacy screens around the stairs, shielding the aircraft entrance from curious media crews who had begun gathering beyond the restricted area. Inside, Amelia received another secure message. She looked toward Daniel. The board has authorized immediate personnel action if necessary. Vanessa's breathing grew shallow. Immediate. Daniel looked at her calmly. Company policy requires us to complete the review first. She nodded quickly. Exactly. There is one more step. Hope briefly returned to her face. "What step?" Daniel answered without emotion. Hearing directly from Mrs. Ellison. Every eye shifted toward Dorothy once again. For several seconds, she remained silent. Then she slowly stood. Robert instinctively offered his arm. She smiled, "Why, I believe I can manage." She walked toward the center of the cabin with steady, measured steps. Not one trace of anger showed on her face, only sadness. She looked first at Emily. "Thank you for choosing honesty." Emily quietly wiped away tears. Dorothy turned toward Robert. "Thank you for standing when it would have been easier to remain seated." Robert nodded respectfully, so it was the right thing. Then Dorothy faced the passengers. "I've flown for many years." She paused. "I've traveled in economy." She smiled softly. "I've traveled in first class. And I've discovered something." Everyone listened. "The seat never tells me who a person is." She glanced toward the elegant leather chairs. "It only tells me where they happen to be sitting." Several passengers lowered their heads. Dorothy slowly turned toward Vanessa. The younger woman could barely meet her eyes. "I want to ask you one question." Vanessa swallowed. "Yes." "When you first saw me," Dorothy's voice remained gentle, "did you see a passenger?" Vanessa remained silent. "Did you see a grandmother? Still nothing. Did you see a human being?" Tears began forming in Vanessa's eyes. Dorothy finished the sentence for her. "You saw a conclusion." The words landed heavier than any accusation. No shouting, no insults, just truth. Vanessa finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Dorothy looked at her quietly. "I believe you are." Vanessa blinked in surprise. "But being sorry," Dorothy continued, "doesn't erase what happened." Daniel slowly closed the evidence folder. "The review is complete." He looked toward Amelia. "We have eyewitness testimony." He looked toward Captain Reeves. "Official incident documentation." He looked toward the passengers. "Multiple video recordings." Finally, he placed one hand on the ownership agreement. "And we now have Mrs. Ellison's statement." The chairman of the board stepped forward. "I believe there is only one matter remaining." He looked directly at Dorothy. "Mrs. Ellison?" His voice carried unmistakable respect. "With your permission, it is time for everyone on this aircraft to learn exactly who you are." The elderly black grandmother smiled gently, for the first time all morning. She nodded. "Please." No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Dorothy Ellison's quiet "please" carried more weight than the shouting that had filled the cabin only minutes earlier. Chairman Harold Bennett stepped forward with both hands clasped in front of him. A man who had spent 3 decades negotiating billion-dollar aviation deals now spoke with remarkable humility. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for your patience." He looked around the cabin before continuing. "This morning at exactly 8:42 a.m., the Board of Directors unanimously approved and finalized the largest ownership transition in Skybridge Executive Aviation's history." Daniel Harper carefully opened the leather portfolio. Inside were notarized contracts, federal transfer certificates, stock ledgers, and the final bill of sale for the Gulfstream G700. Harold lifted the first page. These documents legally transferred ownership of this aircraft." He paused. "And 58% of Skybridge Executive Aviation." Every passenger leaned forward. "To Mrs. Dorothy Ellison." Silence. Absolute silence. Vanessa stared at Dorothy as though she had forgotten how to blink. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." Harold calmly continued. As of this morning, Mrs. Dorothy Ellison is the controlling shareholder, chairwoman of the board, and legal owner of this Gulfstream G700. The words struck the cabin like thunder. The businessman who had mocked Dorothy slowly covered his face with both hands. Oh my God. Another passenger whispered, "She owns this airplane." Robert Hayes smiled quietly. I knew she was someone extraordinary. Emily Parker couldn't hold back her tears. She wasn't crying because Dorothy owned the aircraft. She was crying because the woman who had just been humiliated had never once used her hidden status to defend herself. Captain Michael Reeves instinctively stood straighter. Then, without waiting for instruction, he removed his captain's cap. He walked toward Dorothy. "Madam Chair." His voice was filled with respect. "On behalf of this flight crew," he lowered his head, "I sincerely apologize for everything you experienced aboard this aircraft." Dorothy gently shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for, Captain." He looked surprised. "You sought the truth before reaching a conclusion." She smiled. "That is all any leader can do." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. Behind him, First Officer Elena Brooks quietly did the same, removing her cap as a gesture of respect. Harold Bennett turned another page. For confidentiality reasons, today's acquisition was intentionally withheld from all frontline personnel until after departure. He looked toward the passengers. Only the board, our legal counsel, and executive operations were aware of the transaction. Daniel added, "Mrs. Ellison specifically requested to board as an ordinary passenger." Several passengers looked at Dorothy in disbelief. Harold smiled faintly. "She wanted to experience Skybridge exactly as every customer experiences it." A murmur spread through the cabin. Vanessa felt as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. This wasn't simply a misunderstanding. It had become the most devastating evaluation of customer service imaginable. Dorothy quietly addressed the passengers. "I never intended to test anyone." She glanced toward the windows. "I simply didn't want people treating me differently because of my name." Her eyes returned to Vanessa. "I wanted them to treat me the way they would treat anyone else." The cabin became painfully quiet. Everyone understood what that meant. Dorothy hadn't failed the airline. The airline had failed Dorothy. Harold slowly closed the ownership file. "There is one more matter." He nodded toward Daniel. The attorney retrieved a tablet and connected it to the cabin's large display screen. Security footage appeared. The timestamp showed the exact moment Dorothy boarded. The video played in complete silence. Every passenger watched Vanessa refuse to examine the boarding pass. They watched her kick Dorothy's luggage across the aisle. They watched her shove the 74-year-old grandmother backward. Then the audio filled the cabin. "You really thought a black grandma dressed like that could afford this seat?" Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't bear hearing her own voice, but the recording continued. "First class isn't a charity lounge." Another angle appeared. "I don't need to read the ticket. I know who belongs here." The video ended. No one spoke. No one needed to. The evidence spoke for itself. Harold slowly turned off the screen. "There will be no dispute regarding the facts." Daniel nodded. "The investigation is complete." Vanessa finally stepped forward. Her confident posture had disappeared. Her shoulders trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She stopped only a few feet from Dorothy. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Dorothy answered honestly. "Forgiveness and consequences are not the same thing." Vanessa lowered her head. "I know. I truly am sorry." "I believe you." Vanessa looked up in surprise. You believe me? I do. Dorothy's voice remained gentle. But your apology belongs first to every passenger you've ever judged before learning their story. Vanessa broke down completely. She realized this wasn't just about one morning. It was about years of believing appearances were qualifications. Harold stepped beside Dorothy. Madam Chair. She turned toward him. The authority to determine immediate action now belongs to you. Every executive waited. Every passenger waited. Even Captain Reeves remained motionless. Dorothy looked slowly around the cabin one last time. She saw Emily. Robert, the businessman who had admitted his mistake. The passengers who had spoken the truth. Finally. She looked at Vanessa. Then she spoke the first official words of her leadership. If we want this company to become worthy of the people who trust it, she paused. Then justice must begin before this airplane ever leaves the ground. Those words echoed through the silent cabin. No one knew exactly what decision she was about to make, but every person on board understood one thing. The woman who had been shoved out of first class only minutes earlier was now about to decide the future of everyone standing before her. Dorothy Ellison stood in the center of the cabin, with one hand resting lightly on her walnut cane. No one dared interrupt her. The woman who had boarded as an ordinary 74-year-old black grandmother was now beyond any doubt the legal owner of the aircraft and the new chairwoman of Skybridge Executive Aviation. She looked first at Harold Bennett. Before any decisions are made, she said quietly, I want everyone to hear the complete truth. Harold nodded. Of course. Daniel Harper handed Dorothy a thin blue folder. She smiled faintly. I've been carrying this company in silence for nearly 12 years. The passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Dorothy slowly opened the folder. 12 years ago, Skybridge was 6 weeks away from bankruptcy. Several board members lowered their heads. The previous owner was prepared to liquidate the fleet. Harold spoke softly. She's right. Stite. Our lenders had already begun foreclosure proceedings. Dorothy continued. I didn't buy the company then because I wanted recognition. She looked around the cabin. I bought it because more than 800 employees were about to lose their livelihoods. Captain Reeves felt a chill run down his spine. He had worked for Skybridge for 11 years. He had never known how close the company had come to disappearing. Dorothy turned another page. Most of you know the Skybridge Future Pilot Scholarship. Michael smiled. It changed my daughter's life. Dorothy nodded. It has funded 143 pilots. She looked toward Elena Brooks. 42 aircraft mechanics. Then toward Emily. 36 flight attendants. Emily's eyes widened. My training grant. Dorothy smiled. Yes. Emily covered her mouth. I thought it came from a corporate education fund. It did. Dorothy closed the folder gently. I created that fund. Gasps echoed across the cabin. Vanessa slowly backed against the bulkhead wall. Her breathing became uneven. Every new truth struck harder than the last. The woman she had mocked had paid for the education of people standing only feet away. Harold addressed the passengers. Mrs. Ellison requested absolute anonymity. Not one scholarship recipient knew her identity. Daniel added another detail. She also established the Emergency Family Assistance Fund during the pandemic. Captain Reeves looked stunned. My brother's mortgage. Dorothy smiled. You needed time. You paid 6 months of it. I helped. Michael's voice cracked. You saved our family. The cabin had become almost impossibly quiet. The businessman who had laughed at Dorothy slowly stood once again. "My name is Charles Whitmore." His voice shook. "I've spent 30 years in corporate finance." He looked directly at Dorothy. "I believed success could be measured by appearance." He swallowed hard. "I've never been more ashamed," Dorothy answered gently. "Shame only has value if it changes what comes next." Charles nodded. "It already has." Nearby, Emily quietly stepped beside Vanessa. "You should say something." Vanessa stared blankly at the floor. "What could I possibly say?" Emily answered honestly. "Only the truth." Vanessa slowly lifted her head. She looked at Dorothy, then at the passengers. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I wasn't protecting first class." Everyone listened. I was protecting an image I had invented. Tears rolled freely down her face. "I convinced myself I could identify who belonged." She looked at Dorothy. "And I never realized the only thing I was revealing," she paused, "was the poverty of my own judgment." No one mocked her. No one applauded. The moment was too painful for either. Harold quietly turned toward Daniel. "I believe the board should now review the personnel findings." Daniel nodded. He opened another folder. Our investigation did not stop with today's incident. Vanessa looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel displayed several printed reports. Following Captain Reeves's emergency notification, Executive Operations initiated an expedited audit. Amelia Grant continued. "We reviewed 6 months of customer complaints." She looked directly at Vanessa. 34 formal complaints had been filed involving dismissive or discriminatory treatment. Vanessa stared in disbelief. She recognized some of the dates, some of the names. Complaints she had assumed management quietly ignored. Daniel continued. 4 were dismissed without proper investigation. Harold's expression hardened. The dismissals were authorized by Regional Guest Experience Director Martin Keller. Several executives exchanged serious looks. Amelia added, "He repeatedly instructed supervisors to protect performance statistics instead of investigating employee conduct." Another board member spoke. The problem was never one individual. It became a leadership culture. Dorothy remained silent. She had suspected as much. That was one reason she had insisted on boarding without revealing who she was. She wanted to see the company honestly. Now she had. Harold looked toward the rear of the cabin. "Martin Keller has already been placed on administrative leave pending termination." Several passengers quietly exchanged surprised glances. Daniel continued. 3 supervisors who altered complaint records have also been suspended." Captain Reeves slowly nodded. "So this goes much deeper." "It does." Dorothy finally spoke again. "When leaders ignore small acts of disrespect." She looked around the cabin. "Those acts become habits. And habits eventually become culture." Every employee aboard lowered their eyes. Even the board members seemed affected. Dorothy turned toward Emily. "When you questioned your supervisor," Emily nodded nervously, "you risked your career." "I thought I might lose my job." Dorothy smiled. Instead, she looked toward Harold. "I'd like the board to note her integrity." Harold immediately answered. "It will be entered into the official record." Emily stood speechless. Dorothy then faced Robert Hayes. And Mr. Hayes. The retired Marine straightened instinctively. "You reminded everyone that courage sometimes begins with simply standing up." Robert smiled modestly. I only did what anyone should do. Dorothy shook her head gently. No. If that were true, she glanced around the cabin. You wouldn't have been the first. Those words settled heavily over everyone. Harold looked toward Dorothy. Madam Chair. She met his eyes. The investigation has concluded. The evidence has been verified. The board is prepared to carry out whatever decision you believe serves both justice and the future of this company. Every executive nodded. Captain Reeves remained motionless. Emily held her breath. Vanessa quietly closed her eyes. Dorothy looked once more through the cabin that had become a courtroom without a judge. Then she slowly took her seat in 2A. The very seat she had been told she did not deserve. She placed both hands on her cane, raised her eyes, and calmly prepared to deliver the decision that would forever change Skybridge Executive Aviation. Dorothy Ellison remained seated in 2A, the same seat she had been told she did not deserve only 30 minutes earlier. Her weathered hands rested quietly on the walnut cane that had belonged to her late husband. Around her, the entire cabin waited. Executives, flight crew, passengers. Even the attorneys stood silently. Chairman Harold Bennett finally spoke. Madam Chair, the board is prepared to carry out your decision immediately. Dorothy looked out the oval window for a brief moment. A baggage cart rolled slowly across the sunlit ramp. Ground crews continued their work, unaware that inside the aircraft, the future of an entire company was about to change. She turned back. When my husband came home from military service, she began softly, he told me something I never forgot. The cabin listened. He said the strongest leaders were never the ones who enjoyed exercising power. She smiled faintly. They were the ones who understood the weight of it. No one interrupted. Dorothy looked directly at Vanessa. Miss Cole. Vanessa slowly stepped forward. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Yes, Madam Chair. You offered me an apology. I did. And I believe it was sincere. Fresh tears filled Vanessa's eyes. Thank you. Dorothy gently shook her head. But sincerity does not erase responsibility. Vanessa nodded. I understand. Dorothy looked toward Harold. My first decision as chairwoman is effective immediately. Harold straightened. Yes, madam. T. Vanessa Cole is hereby removed from active flight duty pending final employment review. Vanessa closed her eyes. She had expected those words. Still hearing them broke something inside her. Dorothy continued, Not because I want revenge. She looked around the cabin, but because every passenger deserves to board an aircraft, knowing they will be judged by their ticket, not by their appearance. Harold nodded. It will be done. Dorothy wasn't finished. Regional Guest Experience Director Martin Keller will be terminated immediately. Daniel answered, The paperwork has already been prepared. The supervisors who concealed customer complaints will also be dismissed. Already authorized. Dorothy slowly stood. Now we begin rebuilding. The executives instinctively took out notebooks. My second decision. She looked toward Emily Parker. Miss Parker. Emily blinked. Yes, Madam Chair. You demonstrated integrity when speaking the truth, carried personal risk. Emily swallowed hard. I was just trying to do the right thing. Dorothy smiled warmly. Exactly. She turned toward Harold. I would like Emily Parker promoted into Skybridge's Leadership Development Program. Emily's eyes widened. What? Harold smiled. Congratulations. Emily covered her mouth. I don't know what to say. Dorothy answered gently. Keep telling the truth. That's enough. The passengers applauded. For the first time that morning, the applause felt joyful instead of uncomfortable. Dorothy then faced Captain Michael Reeves. Captain, yes, Madam Chair. I've trusted this company with thousands of flights. She smiled. Today you reminded me why. Michael lowered his head respectfully. You insisted on facts before judgment. Dorothy extended her hand. I hope you'll continue leading this flight. He shook it firmly. It would be my honor. She turned toward Robert Hayes. And Mr. Hayes. The retired Marine smiled. I had a feeling you weren't finished with me. Soft laughter spread throughout the cabin. Dorothy laughed as well. I wasn't. She reached into her handbag and removed a small cream-colored envelope. I've learned that courage deserves to be recognized. Robert accepted it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. Beneath it lay a certificate. Skybridge Veterans Travel Lifetime Pass. Unlimited flights. For life. Robert looked up in disbelief. I can't accept this. Dorothy smiled. You already did. The moment you stood up for someone you didn't know. The old Marine wiped away a tear. Thank you. The businessman Charles Whitmore slowly approached Dorothy. I owe you one more apology. Dorothy nodded. I know. I spent my career evaluating companies. He looked down, but I forgot how to evaluate myself. Dorothy placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The best investments are the people we're willing to become after we've been wrong. Charles smiled through tears. I'll remember that. Harold stepped forward again. Madam Chair, would you like us to prepare the aircraft for departure? Dorothy looked around the cabin. She saw fear gradually replaced by relief, shame replaced by reflection, silence replaced by hope. Yes. She smiled, but first, she looked at every employee aboard. Beginning today, Skybridge Executive Aviation will adopt a new company promise. Daniel immediately opened his notebook. Dorothy spoke slowly. Every passenger, she paused, every employee, every family, every seat will be treated with equal dignity. She looked toward the cabin entrance. We will also establish a new initiative. Harold nodded. The name, Dorothy smiled. Every seat deserves respect. The board unanimously applauded. So ordered, Harold announced. The program will include mandatory leadership training, anonymous customer protection, reporting employee ethics education, and expanded travel assistance for senior citizens and military veterans. Emily quietly whispered, This company is going to change. Captain Reeves smiled. It already has. Minutes later, the aircraft door finally closed. Captain Reeves's calm voice echoed through the cabin speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your extraordinary patience today. He smiled toward Dorothy. It is my privilege to welcome you aboard Skybridge Executive Aviation. Outside the Gulf Stream, G700 slowly pushed back from the stand. Inside, no one cared about luxury anymore. The finest thing on board had never been the leather seats. It had been the character of the woman sitting in seat 2A. As the aircraft lifted into the bright morning sky, Dorothy quietly opened her journal. Beneath the sentence she had written that morning, may people remember how they made others feel. She added one final line. Justice begins the moment we choose to see the humanity in someone before we judge their appearance. She closed the journal. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the wings. Inside the cabin, a new journey had already begun.
True greatness is never revealed by wealth status or the seat someone occupies. It is revealed by the respect we show when we believe no one important is watching. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from in the comments, tell us what lesson stayed with you the most, and subscribe for more stories that remind us why kindness and justice will always matter.